Okay, hi again, everybody. This is going to be lecture number 5 for our course on the history and principles of literary criticism. What I want to do today is wrap up our look at our first text in this course, Plato's Ion, and also look forward a little bit to the text with which we'll be dealing probably for the next 2 weeks, I think. And that's Plato's much longer dialogue, his masterwork, in fact. Excuse me, the Republic, of which we are not reading all, I hasten to add. We're basically going to be looking at Book 10 of Plato's Republic. And having taken a look over the last number of lectures at Plato's Ion, at Homer a little bit, this classic, to say the least, uniquely important and influential text of ancient Greek culture, I'd like today to, again, wrap up a little bit by way of the question with which we really started, which is why we have to deal with Plato's Ion, Plato's Republic in our course, why that makes, I think, if not an essential, at least a very useful starting place for us. Obviously, and as we have discussed in various ways, Plato himself is certainly not a literary critic per se. There isn't really any such thing as a literary critic or literary criticism as such in the ancient world. Plato, like his master Socrates, is a philosopher. And we can, I think, briefly and usefully just say a little bit, that is, about the areas in which Plato primarily is working as a philosopher, areas, that is, from which he takes a view of the phenomenon of literature. And we can identify 3 of these areas of Platonic philosophy, or areas where Plato functions as a philosopher. The first is what is called epistemology. That's theory of knowledge. And by the way, I'll be putting these vocabulary terms on Canvas, so if you're worried about writing down the spelling right now, don't worry about that. Epistemology, or theory of knowledge. The second area in which Plato really operates, especially in the Republic, not so much here, is the area of philosophy called ontology. That's theory of being. And a third area, a much less fancy word, moral philosophy. Plato has a lot to say about the philosophy of morals. Again, mostly in the Republic, not really here. On all 3 of these counts, epistemology, ontology, and morals, we find Plato and Plato's Socrates turning his attention toward the phenomenon of literature, taking a philosophical perspective on the phenomenon of literature. We could even say, without exaggerating too very much, we could even say that Plato is a little bit obsessed with the phenomenon of literature in his time, in his society and culture. It's not just this little dialogue, this brief dialogue, the Ion, where he talks about Homer and poetry and its various implications. In the Republic, as we'll see, which is really Plato's masterwork, the relationship between philosophy and literature is one that plays, let's say, if not a central, then a structuring role for the whole massive, long consideration that Plato gives in that work to the theory of justice, which is actually his main concern in the Republic. As we'll see, starting next week, the Republic, Plato's masterwork, actually concludes in Book 10 with a very long consideration and again very negative consideration of the phenomenon of literature. It becomes the concluding issue, really, of Plato's whole work. So what do we have in looking at Plato, the Ion, and the Republic? We don't have anything that is really functioning within the discipline of literary criticism as such, no. What we do have, however, is ancient and foundational commentary on our questions, the questions that inform and underwrite this course. And again, they are the questions, first of all, in what ways can we evaluate any given work of literature? In what ways, in accordance with what standards or ideas, can we say that this or that work of literature is any good or not? And more broadly, in what ways, in accordance with what standards, ideas, criteria, whatever, can we evaluate the whole phenomenon of literature in general? In what way can we say if it is any good literature? And if so, what is it good for? Those are our two questions in a course like this one. And these are questions, as I've been trying to say, that Plato, through his Socrates, certainly is thinking about a lot. And through Plato's Socrates, what we're getting, as we have been seeing over the last little while, is a very hard-hitting, very negative critique, very negative answers, that is, being given to our two questions, the ones that I just re-articulated. So with regard to the whole phenomenon of literary expression in the broadest sense, and in fact Plato will even tend to broaden this to the whole phenomenon of representational art, including visual art, but let's just keep it to literature for now. With regard to the whole phenomenon of literature, is it any good? What is it good for? Plato's Socrates answers quite sweepingly and very negatively that it really doesn't seem to be good for anything from his philosophical point of view, whether we're thinking in terms of epistemology, theory of knowledge, whether we're thinking in terms of ontology, theory of being, or whether we're thinking in terms of moral philosophy. Plato's Socrates, again, sweepingly, uncompromisingly, even rather destructively, he will tend to look at literature and say, well, that's just not the thing. That doesn't add anything. Doesn't seem to be good for anything. That's his very uncompromising view. And if you take that view of literature in general, it's just kind of a waste of time, which is Socrates' view. If you take that view of literature in general, then, well, I think the answer to the other question follows automatically. If literature in general is not really good for anything, then surely it's going to be the case that any given work of literature, any given poem or play or story or what have you, is not good for anything and really isn't any good. It will end up like that. The only exception to this rule, as we'll find again when we get to the Republic, is that Plato's Socrates does want to approve of works of literature that are crafted precisely in accordance with his kind of critique. And what that will mean in practice, as we'll see, is that he does want to approve of works of literature that have a strong agenda of kind of moral improvement. Songs in praise of famous men and stuff like that. But that's the only exception to the rule. A Platonic literature, let's say, is okay. But other than that, no. There's no place for that in the philosophical society as it is envisioned and expressed by Plato's Socrates. Now, with regard to this brief dialogue, the Ion, with which we have been busy for the last couple of weeks, what's really useful, I think, I hope, for our purposes in this course, is that in the ion, or rather, forgive me, what matters here is the answer that Socrates gives in the ion to a question we might pose him. So we might say to Socrates, okay, I get that you're saying, you don't see that literature has any place in the examined life or in a philosophical society. Why? Why is it no good? What's the problem? Socrates in the ion gives a rather targeted, a rather focused, and I think quite an intelligible answer to this question. In the ion, Socrates is saying literature is a waste of time because it has no relationship to knowledge. So we're very much, in this dialogue, we're very much on the epistemological track of Plato's philosophy and of his critique of the cultural phenomenon of knowledge, of literature, excuse me. Remember, for Plato's Socrates, he has a very clear idea of what he thinks knowledge is. It is not an exotic idea. It's totally reasonable, but it's just worth getting very clear about it. Knowledge for Plato's Socrates is the rational grasping of facts. And he is unable to see what role literature really plays in that project of knowledge. So we have a totally negative, for Plato Socrates, a totally alienated relationship between knowledge and literature, between epistemology and rhapsody, the kind of thing that Ion does, his profession as a performer and interpreter and, in a sense, scholar of Homer. So, in the world of the Ion, this dialogue, if we ask Plato or Plato's Socrates, is literature any good? The most generous answer he's going to be able to allow is something like, well, I guess it's okay if you like that sort of thing. Literature, rhapsody, if you like going a bit crazy sometimes, if you like getting messed up, if you like going to see Ion and finding yourself, weeping uncontrollably in the audience as he tells some aspect of the story of the Iliad or the Odyssey, if you like losing your mind, I guess it's okay. So it's like the kind of answer one might give to the question, is getting drunk any good? Is it good for anything? Well, if you like that sort of thing, losing your mind, going a bit nuts. Bungee jumping, is that any good? Is it good for anything? Well, if you like that sort of thing. But from a philosophical point of view, and in particular an epistemological point of view in the Ion, of course, as we have said now several times already, Socrates is answering much more simply, no, it's good for nothing. It is the negation, literature, of the project of knowledge as Socrates understands and presents it. And to bang this drum one more time, it all comes down for Socrates to the question of subject matter. Stuff, content, aspects of the world that you can know about. Any given discipline, any given profession is about something. It has some subject matter that is proper, if not unique, to it. Socrates' argument in the Ion, as we have seen, is that the rhapsode Ion doesn't have his own subject matter. He is the person who knows Homer, he knows literature, but that does not help us because Socrates wants to argue that literature itself does not have its own subject matter or subject matters. Knowing literature, Socrates is arguing, and this is the argument that we are entering, as it were, into the baseline of our course, I suppose, as a challenge that we can think of ourselves as having the opportunity either to agree with or to try to refute. Knowing literature, understanding literature, according to Plato's Socrates, in the last analysis, that really comes down to understanding nothing, being expert in nothing, having no subject matter. Even though, of course, as Plato will recognize even more clearly in the Republic, and underline, let's say, even more strongly in the Republic. Even though to be expert in literature such as Homer does mean dabbling in a lot of things, in a lot of subject matters. In fact, it involves dabbling in or knowing a little bit about almost any and every subject matter. That happens, of course, because literature is a kind of representation of the world, a kind of copy or picture of the world in words. The world, of course, is everything, as Wittgenstein might remind us. The world is everything. Literature representing the world is going to give a representation of everything, a glimpse, a bit, a copy, an image, a hint, a fragment of this or that subject matter, of all the subject matters that make up the world. But clearly, if you want to get serious about this or that subject matter, you're going to go to the world to learn about it and become expert in it. You're not going to go to literature. So to give one of the examples that Socrates uses one more time, let's say that you can learn from Homer, you can learn a little bit about chariot racing, an important activity of the ancient world. Maybe we could even say that in reading Homer, you might get really excited about chariot racing, you might get inspired to learn more about it, become good at it, become an expert at it in one way or another. But clearly at that point, if you want to pursue your interest in chariot racing, you are not going to go get a degree in Homer. No. You're going to go find somebody who is expert in making, racing, repairing chariots, and you're going to apprentice yourself to that person to learn about that subject matter. So that's the critique with which we are beginning our course, with which we have now begun our course. And I do think that Plato in the Ion is offering a critique that remains highly relevant, very challenging for us, very problematic in the best sense. I mean, a problem that confronts us and that we need to have an answer for in the contemporary business, including in the university today, of the academic study of literature, what we call vaguely and traditionally literary criticism. And I want right now just to highlight, make explicit, two main ways in which I think this Platonic critique that we have in the Ion continues to have traction, continues to make a claim upon us, continues to be challenging for us in literary studies today. First, there is no question, I must tell you, as somebody who has devoted his life to these matters, there is no question that literary departments today have become exceedingly eclectic, by which I mean you will have a very hard time if you look at what is taught in literary departments, if you look at what literature professors, English professors do, study, publish on for their actual research, you will have a very hard time, I would like simply to assert, explaining or articulating what the general or shared subject matter is. Okay? There is a sense today in which in English departments or in literary studies in general, you can study anything and everything. And I do think, and I will even say I fear, that a Platonic logic continues to be operative here. Why is it the case that in a department of English you can find yourself doing work, sort of, in psychology, in macroeconomics, in the study of human reproductive biology, and many, many, many other topics. Why? Well, because we study literature. Literature represents the world. All that stuff is in the world, and therefore we end up studying all that stuff. Sort of. But I fear that Socrates' critique in the Ion continues to operate, because I fear he's going to be able to say, look, that's great. It's great that you're dabbling, guys. But really, if one wants to become expert in these subject matters, one is going to go to the world and learn about those subject matters. And lo and behold, in the university, we have departments which are founded on and all about the study of all of these subject matters. You're going to go there, not to the literary department if you want to learn about these various aspects of the world. And I shared with you guys somewhat ironically and perhaps very vainly, I shared with you guys on Canvas as a handout a blog post I did on this a couple of years ago, and I will confess that the way I set that up, I was trying to to make it seem a little bit funny, but I think that's because it actually is a little bit funny. So that's the first main, really interesting challenge that I think Plato's Ion continues to hold out for us. The critique he's making of Ion, and by extension of Homer, that from Homer and then from Ion as the scholar of Homer, we're getting a little bit of insight, a little bit of understanding of a kind of infinite range of subject matters without ever going into them in depth and without ever understanding what the actual proper subject matter of literary study is. That critique that Plato's Socrates offers vis-a-vis Ion, the rhapsode, that critique, I'm afraid, continues to cut a lot of ice, let's say, in the Literary Academy today. The second reason that I think Plato's Ion really continues to have legs for us has to do with that kind of strange or backhanded or negative concession that he makes to Ion and to Ion's sense of his own expertise. It's that concept of inspired madness, divinely inspired madness, which Socrates is willing to allow as something Ion really owns and is really expert at. He's really expert at letting himself be possessed by a god, to put it in Greek terms, losing his mind through divine inspiration and thereby being able to perform Homer to great heights of emotional effect and bringing his audience along to those similar heights. And I introduced in a previous lecture a term which is actually a Latin term, but it's not in obviously Plato's Greek, but it comes along later in the Platonic tradition, and we have an English version of this term. We say furor, which means distress, chaos of all kinds. The Latin Platonic term furor, F-U-R-O-R, that's a term that I introduced because it is used in the tradition as a technical term for exactly this kind of divinely inspired madness. And it is really a lovely touch in this dialogue, the Ion, that, Ion doesn't really mind that. You may even have been struck by the very concluding exchange between Socrates and Ion. Remember, as I was saying last time, Socrates gets quite kind of frustrated in this dialogue, which is very, very interesting and wonderful. At the end, he's like, it becomes one of those conversations which actually breaks off, right? Which is amazing as an effect of this piece. Socrates basically, and then says, there's no point talking to you. Block! It's like that. But just before doing that, he says to Ion, okay, look, as far as I can tell, you're either a liar in claiming to have expertise, or you're crazy. through that divine inspiration. What do you want to be, Ion? A liar or crazy? And Ion says, well, crazy is cooler. I think I'll take that. So what I'm trying to get at here, perhaps not very well for the moment, but what I'm trying to get at here is that we have in Plato one of the origins, at least, of the very powerful and persistent tradition of creativity, artistic creativity, as precisely a kind of madness. Something that takes hold of the artist, the poet, the composer, the musician, what have you. Something that takes hold of the artist without his or her really having any volition, certainly without his or her really having any cognition, any thinking or knowledge involved. This is recognizable as a romantic idea. I mean, a capital R romantic idea. And again, I gave you a handout on that for this lecture. It's Samuel Taylor Coleridge's brilliant kind of ultra-romantic poem, Kubla Khan, from the early 19th century. So this has entered the tradition as a capital R romantic idea, as a kind of edgy idea, kind of punk rock idea. The artist is the one who goes crazy, right? Even perhaps the one who goes crazy with the help of other substances or experiences that help you get messed up. Coleridge's Kubla Khan is explicitly composed. I mean, Coleridge presents that poem in the context of this little story. It's explicitly supposed to have been composed while Coleridge is under the influence of opium, in an opium dream. And that romantic attitude looks at that. Wow, man, you took drugs and wrote that poem. So cool. That attitude is still with us, I think. Still very much underlying a lot of our culture's assumptions about what creativity fundamentally is. What I want to point out, and what I think is maybe a very cool and surprising takeaway that we can have from our encounter with Plato's Ion, what I want to point out is that that idea of the inspired, crazy, perhaps drug-addled artist, that idea in the first place and in the last analysis, it is actually a Platonic idea. It is the flip side, you see, of Socrates' conception about what knowledge is. And that may remain for the moment a kind of tantalizing relationship. And I'm happy to leave it at that for the moment, because I think this is something which actually is very, very difficult to grasp and articulate. And I think it is a genuinely profound thing. And on that account, I'd like it to be something that we can talk about in tutorial and keep talking about as we go through the course. For now, I just want to make the point about this legacy of that idea of the artist. Coleridge, at the end of Kubla Khan, that incredible work of the Romantic period, he envisions himself becoming the artist that he wants to become. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that pleasure dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating air. Coleridge gives us this incredible kind of electric vision of, that's what art is, that's what creativity is. Losing your mind, becoming like a maddened, orgiastic priest, flashing eyes, floating hair. That's Coleridge's vision. Plato's Socrates actually looks at that and says, exactly. That's exactly what the artist is and does. So for Plato and Coleridge actually to be on the same page, that I think is really interesting and something, again, that is still with us and something that we want to talk about more. Okay, I want to wrap up now in about 10 minutes, and that will be enough, I think, for this concluding lecture of our look at the ion. We have, as I said earlier in the lecture, as our baseline position or starting point for our whole course, we have a challenge. We have a total shutdown by Plato's Socrates of our two questions. What is literature good for? Plato's Socrates answers, basically nothing. Since literature, he says, is good basically for nothing, then necessarily almost any given work of literature, any poem, play, epic, whatever, is going not to be very good, and certainly is going not to be good for very much. So we begin in a very bad situation, and accordingly, we may want to begin to identify or sketch or look for some escape routes from this situation. And I want to conclude this lecture then by pointing at what I think are some of those escape routes. I'm not going to present them systematically. I'm just going to point at them in no particular order. And these then, I hope, can be ideas that we will be able to talk about in tutorial and further as we go through the course. So, escape routes. If we try to get out of the ion room, so to speak, what might they be? Well, one, perhaps, which we have already touched on, would be to point out that Plato has given us a representation of a dialogue, but it is a dialogue that fails. Socrates, even though he holds all the cards, so to speak, in this dialogue, he is unable to enforce his view on Ion, his interlocutor. He's unable to enforce his view on Ion, even though Ion kind of recognizes and accepts that Socrates has won the argument. When Socrates wins, he's still not able to win. There's something very odd, very ironic, and potentially very, very interesting going on there. Is there a sense, to push this one a little bit farther, explore it a little bit farther? Is there a sense in which Ion actually understands dialogue better than Socrates does? Are there limits to philosophy that Ion understands, beyond which he operates in a way that Socrates does not? Or is there something in literature that Socrates just doesn't get? Is there something there that vitiates or renders helpless his philosophical agenda? You guys will remember, of course, I hope, that Superman, the more or less original superhero of the 20th century, Superman can do anything, lift anything, run any speed, he can move planets around, whatever, unless you confront him with a piece of kryptonite, that glowing green mineral from his home planet of Krypton, which I mention not because I'm a Superman geek, but because I want to ask, in a silly form, a serious question: is literature Socrates' kryptonite? Does it render his philosophy helpless, which is how kryptonite renders Superman? And if so, why? So that's one potential escape route in the form of a question. Perhaps related, and again, this is one we've touched on a little bit. Why is the rhapsode Socrates' target in the Ion specifically? He doesn't go after the poet, Homer. He doesn't go after the audience. He goes after this figure in the middle, Ion, who transmits Homer to the audience in a moment of orality. That's what the rhapsode does. He speaks. Yeah. Homer writes, at least the Greeks think that Homer writes. They have him in written form, let's put it that way. Homer is writing his text. Plato writes. Ion doesn't write. Ion just talks. And there's somebody else, of course, in this scenario who only talks, who is associated only with oral utterance rather than with the written word. And that, of course, is Socrates, Plato's philosophical master, who insisted that philosophy had to involve dialogic back and forth in real time, in spoken words. So is there something about orality, which is Socrates' own medium? Excuse me, is there something about orality that Ion understands better than Socrates does? And if so, what might it be? That maybe is another potential escape route from the Ion room. And I'll go through another couple of these. Another one, not really related to the previous two that I just mentioned. It becomes evident as we go through the Ion, and especially as Socrates starts to get a bit frustrated with his interlocutor, it becomes evident that Socrates knows a lot of Homer. And in fact, he starts rattling off really long, complicated quotes from Homer in the latter part of this dialogue. And there is something a little bit odd about that. Granted, Homer is part of Socrates' cultural inheritance as a member of ancient Greek society, but still, if there's nothing in literature, if there's no point to Homer, why does Socrates know so much of it? Why is he seemingly a bit of a Homer geek, even while claiming that Homer teaches him nothing as a citizen or a philosopher? And another potential route, which is related to that previous one. Socrates knows a lot of Homer. That's really odd. Along those same lines, we might just notice all over again how Socrates explains what Ion does. I don't mean the idea of madness, but I mean to point out that Socrates explains that idea of Ion's inspired furor, or divine madness. He explains that idea in a very, very particular and quite special way. He explains it via the metaphor of the magnet, right? That whole weird picture he has of the muse magnetizing Homer, who magnetizes Ion, who magnetizes his audience. In other words, Socrates operates there through metaphor. Or we could even probably be a bit more specific and say that he operates through the kind of metaphor that we call simile. He says, well, your relationship to Homer, Ion, it's like the relationship between a piece of iron and the magnet. It's simile that Socrates turns to in order to give a theory of why Ion is able to do what he does, why he lights up when Homer comes into the picture, but goes to sleep when other poets do. Simile, obviously, is a literary device. And so we're able to make the point that Socrates actually relies on a manifestly literary device in order to make his argument about Ion work. And in fact, in Homer specifically, one of the absolutely signature aspects of Homer is the use of simile. And if you go back and just look again, even just glance again, skim over it at the handout I gave you guys from Odyssey, book 19, you will be able to circle the long similes. We call them epic similes, through which Homer will very typically narrate a scene or carry out a description. So that's another potential escape route. It has to do precisely with the literariness of Socrates' attack on literature. And if we explore that one a little farther, I think we will find ourselves talking again about the form of text that Plato chooses to write. He writes dialogues. He writes these little playlets. He does not speak in his own voice. He puts words in the mouth of his master Socrates. These are manifestly literary techniques, right? Specifically dramatic techniques. And again, I'm not right now carrying that thought through to any kind of argumentative conclusion. I'm just pointing that out as another potential escape route from Socrates' argument. And this is the last little potential escape route that I want to point to. It has to do with the remarkable answer, as we saw in the last lecture, that Ion gives in the end to Socrates' demand about the nature of literary expertise. What the heck do you really know about, Ion? Do you really know about chariot racing? No. Do you really know about how to mix a bath, like Euryclea does for Odysseus in Book 19 of the Odyssey? No. Do you really know about spinning wool, just because Homer talks about spinning wool sometimes? No. What do you really know about Ion? Remember, Ion eventually says, well, the rhapsode will know, and I don't remember the exact words, but he says something like, the rhapsode will know what a man and a woman ought to say, and what a master and what a slave and what a ruler and what a servant ought to say. He says this. It comes kind of out of the blue, and yet Ion is very confident in this answer. Later, that answer, Socrates is able to push it a bit, and he pushes Ion into what seems to be the absurd position that the rhapsode understands what it is to be a general, strategos, a commander of armies, which does seem ridiculous. But if we tie it back to the earlier version of that answer, Ion seems to be articulating, and again, this is not something that I'm working out or making sense of, I'm just pointing to it as something that we might want to make sense of. Ion seems to be articulating a subject matter relationship, a relationship of expertise between literature and some version of moral conduct, some question of how to behave, how to speak in particular, what a man and a woman ought to say, and what a master and what a slave. And I do not mean, by the way, to be giving any kind of brownie points to the vision of social or political hierarchy that lies within Ion's statement. I simply mean to point out that his claim is the rhapsode knows about behavior, something like that. The rhapsode will have an insight into ethics, into how people ought to be, and in particular, the rhapsode will have an insight into rhetoric, because it's about how they speak, right? The rhapsode will have an interest, and an insight rather, into how people ought to speak. And there may be something very interesting and yet very kind of practical and intelligible, not mysterious, but intelligible in that half-formed answer that Ion gives. So that's the last of these little potential escape routes that I want to give. And again, these are points which I would like us to discuss in tutorial, and also I would like us to have these thumbtacks, these question marks on the board as we go through the course. Okay, we should wrap up this lecture. I just want to conclude it with another brief mention of the handouts I gave you about that Platonic furor, inspired creative madness. I gave you two of them, two handouts on this point. One, the Coleridge, which I've already recited a little bit of, and I was a big Coleridge fan when I was younger. The other, though, is from Shakespeare. It's from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. It is the famous exchange between Theseus and Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, at the beginning of Act 5, Scene 1 in Midsummer Night's Dream. I just want to conclude the lecture by asking that you guys make sure that you look at both of those handouts. Coleridge and Plato, as I've already said, are to a remarkable extent on the same page about what creativity is, about what art is. Their shared view is that it's just going crazy, losing your mind in the grip of divine inspiration. Shakespeare's version from the very beginning of the 17th century is quite a bit more interesting, I think. Shakespeare's Theseus, and this is a very, very famous bit, for lack of a better word, in Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Theseus is on that Platonic page. He says the lover, the poet, and the madman are of imagination all compact. In other words, lover, poet, and madman, they're all the same mindset. They're all crazy. That's Theseus's Platonic view. Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, doesn't quite buy it. She has, I think, a deeper and also a higher insight, even though it remains somewhat tantalizing, as she says at the very end of that exchange, strange and admirable. So I will ask you guys to look at those handouts and maybe do a little bit of thinking about some of the questions I've raised here prior to tutorial this week, and I will see you then. The next lecture will be the beginning of our look at Plato's Republic, Book 10. Okay, thank you very much, as always, for your attention.